Tokyo, November 1988. Winter had begun to descend upon Japan's capital, bringing with it bitter winds that snaked through every street and alleyway. The sky was blanketed in a thick layer of grey clouds, casting an eerie gloom over the entire city. Pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, eager to escape the biting cold and retreat to the warmth of their homes. Among the thousands making their way through the bustling streets, one young girl walked alone, following the familiar path from school to home. Junko Furuta, 17 years old, was a bright, cheerful high school student, embodying the innocence and dreams of youth. She was not only known for her beauty and kind demeanor, but also for being an excellent student, well liked by her teachers and friends alike. Junko's family was not wealthy, but they lived happily and peacefully in a modest home in Misato, Saitama Prefecture. To her parents and those around her, she was a source of pride, a beacon of hope and a promising future. On the afternoon of November 25th, after an ordinary day at school, Junko bid farewell to her friends and quickly left the school gates. Wearing her familiar school uniform, she walked briskly down the usual path leading home. The route was not long. It was one she had taken countless times before. But that day, for some reason, it felt different. A sense of unease crept over her, an inexplicable feeling that something was wrong. She tried to brush it off, blaming it on the early winter sunset that made the world grow dark far too quickly. As the last light of day faded into the horizon, Junko Furuta never made it home. Her family grew increasingly anxious when she did not arrive at her usual time. They called her school, reached out to her friends, but no one had seen Junko since she left. Worry turned into panic as the hours passed without any word from her. Fearing the worst, her parents contacted the police and launched a desperate search, combing through every possible clue. But no one could have imagined what had already happened. In a matter of hours, Junko Furuta's life had been thrown into unimaginable darkness, far away from the safety of her home and loved ones. Her family had no way of knowing that at that very moment she had fallen into the hands of the most ruthless monsters imaginable, and that her nightmare was only just beginning. As soon as they received the report of Junko Furuta's unusual disappearance, the Saitama Prefectural Police immediately launched an investigation to find the 17-year-old high school student. Junko's family, overcome with fear and despair, distributed flyers, questioned her classmates and teachers, desperately hoping for any lead that could reveal their daughter's whereabouts. But all they received was a chilling silence, as if Junko had vanished from existence. At that same moment, no one knew that Junko Furuta was actually very close, held captive inside a house located in the middle of a busy neighborhood. She had been abducted on her way home that evening by a group of male students from her school. The leader of the group was Hiroshi Miyano, a delinquent who had been infatuated with Junko for some time, but was rejected. Enraged and humiliated by her refusal, he lost all control and devised a cruel scheme to exact his revenge. Under threats that her family would be harmed if she resisted, Junko had no choice but to comply, stepping into a trap that would forever change her life. When she arrived at the house belonging to one of the boys, Junko realized the unimaginable horror awaiting her. Inside a secluded room on the upper floor, she became the victim of unspeakable cruelty. In the first few days, she cried, pleaded, and begged to be released, but her captors only laughed, mocking her pain with chilling indifference. As time passed, the horror inside that room escalated beyond anything a human being should ever endure. But the nightmare did not stop with them. The group of boys called others to join in, bragging about what they had done. They subjected Junko to unimaginable torment, showing no remorse, no hesitation, as if human decency had completely abandoned them. Meanwhile, outside the walls of that house, neighbors began to sense something was wrong. Strange noises, weak cries for help in the middle of the night. But no one intervened. No one wanted to get involved. While the police continued their investigation, in vain, no one suspected that Junko Furuta was still alive, just a few kilometers from her home. living through the most horrific ordeal imaginable. Her family never stopped searching, but every clue led to a dead end. The investigation stalled, and with each passing day, despair deepened for both her family and the authorities. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Her suffering continued in terrifying silence. No one could have known that the darkest truths of this case had yet to be revealed, and that soon enough the horrifying reality would finally be brought to light. The following days in Junko Furuta's life quickly spiraled into an endless nightmare. Inside that cramped and darkened room, she endured horrors beyond human comprehension. Her captors, Hiroshi Miyano and his gang, showed no mercy, no limits. As their sadistic brutality escalated, they took turns tormenting and abusing her with unimaginable cruelty. At first, the young girl resisted, fought back, and pleaded for help. But the more she struggled, the more savage the beatings became. Over time, Junko realized that any attempt to resist only fueled their monstrous acts. The 17-year-old girl, once filled with dreams and aspirations, was now reduced to silent endurance, trapped in an abyss of despair, praying for a miracle to deliver her from this living hell. Meanwhile, outside, police were still searching for Junko, but every effort led to a dead end. They had no idea that her captors were merely high school boys, students who seemed normal on the surface. Even when officers patrolled near the area where Junko was being held, the perpetrators cunningly staged a deception, ensuring that no suspicion would fall upon them. Police walked past unaware that beyond those walls, a girl was crying out for help, her voice muffled by the cruelty surrounding her. Neighbors too sensed something was wrong. Strange noises, unusual visitors, coming and going at odd hours. But fear of involvement, indifference and silence kept them from speaking up. And so the silence became complicit, allowing the torment to continue unchecked. Empowered by this apathy, the captors grew bolder, descending further into their depravity, carrying out unthinkable acts with no fear of consequence. For more than 40 days, Junko Furuta endured the most horrific suffering imaginable. She lost all hope. Each day became an eternity of agony. But perhaps the most painful realization was this: no one was coming for her. Her captors roamed free, while her family desperately searched, unaware of the horrors unfolding so close to home. Time continued to pass, and Junko Furuta's condition worsened by the day. The young girl, once full of life and dreams, was now nothing but a shadow of her former self. Her body grew frail, covered in wounds, completely incapable of resisting. Her willpower had been eroded by the relentless cruelty of her captors, but even when it seemed like all hope was lost, a foolish mistake by the perpetrators led to a turning point in the case. On January 23, 1989, more than a month after Junko went missing, Hiroshi Miyano and his accomplices made a fatal error. In an act completely unrelated to Junko, they attacked another young man and beat him mercilessly. However, this time the victim was luckier than Junko. He did not remain silent. The moment he had a chance, he escaped and reported the assault to the police. When law enforcement arrested Miyano and his group for questioning about the assault, they had no idea they were about to uncover one of the most horrific crimes in Japan's history. During the interrogation, one of the perpetrators accidentally let slip a chilling phrase: "the body of a girl in a house." The detective immediately sensed something was terribly wrong and decided to expand the investigation. The police quickly identified the location that the suspect had mentioned. When they entered the house where Junko had been held, the first thing they noticed was not the signs of a typical fight, but a putrid stench that filled the air. A wave of unease washed over them as they continued their search. And then they found something beyond anyone's imagination: Junko Furuta's body, encased in a concrete drum. Every officer at the scene stood in stunned silence as they realized what had happened. The sight before them was not just the result of a simple murder, but the traces of a 44-day-long reign of terror. When they extracted Junko's remains from the concrete, the countless injuries covering her body told the entire story. This was not just murder, it was a deliberate act of unimaginable brutality. News of the crime spread across Japan like wildfire, igniting a wave of national outrage unlike anything seen before. The public could not fathom how a group of teenagers could commit such monstrous acts. One question loomed over everyone's minds: how could a girl be imprisoned and tortured to death in the middle of a residential neighborhood without anyone stepping in to stop it? To this day, the answer to that question remains one of Japan's most unsettling truths. But when the case was finally brought to light, something made the public even angrier. The trial and sentencing of the perpetrators. The entire nation was about to witness one of the most controversial court cases in Japan's legal history. A trial that would determine the fate of the monsters responsible for this nightmare. The courtroom was packed. A heavy silence hung over the rows of seats where Junko Furuta's family sat in quiet agony, their vacant eyes fixed on the front of the room. The bright overhead lights reflected off the polished wood of the defendant's stand, where the four perpetrators who had committed the horrific crime sat with their heads lowered, avoiding the burning stares of hatred directed at them. The moment of judgment had arrived, but no one knew if justice would truly be served for Junko. As the list of their crimes was read aloud, each word echoed through the room, sending chills down every spine. Every gruesome detail of the 44 days of hell that Junko had endured was revisited. The prosecutors spared nothing. Every wound, every plea for mercy, every act of cruelty these monsters had inflicted. They painted a horrifying picture of Junko's suffering, and when they finished, the courtroom fell into an eerie, suffocating silence. Some people lowered their heads, unable to bear it. Others clenched their fists, their eyes welling with rage. Junko's mother gripped the edge of her seat, her body trembling. Her father sat motionless, his eyes hollow, as if there were no more tears left for him to shed. The defendants remained expressionless. Hiroshi Miyano, the ringleader, kept his head down, his eyes darting away, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. He did not utter a single word, showing no signs of remorse or fear. Joe Ogura leaned back with an air of defiance, his lips pressed together as if trying to maintain his composure. Yasushi Watanabe and Shinji Minato sat motionless, their faces devoid of emotion, as if they were merely waiting for the inevitable. None of them shed a tear. None of them uttered an apology. All four of them knew that no matter what they said, they would never be forgiven. The judge's gavel struck the bench, his voice ringing with authority. The sentences were delivered, each word cutting through the air like a blade. Hiroshi Miyano, 20 years in prison. Joe Ogura, 8 years in prison. Yasushi Watanabe, 5 to 7 years. Shinji Minato, 4 to 6 years. A stunned silence followed, as if no one could believe what they had just heard. And then in an instant the courtroom erupted in outrage. Angry shouts filled the air, sobs broke through the commotion, and the cries of those who had held back their fury for too long now surged uncontrollably. Junko's mother collapsed into her seat, shaking violently. Another relative sobbed, choking on their grief. The crowd inside the courtroom murmured at first, then shouted, "This is unacceptable. Where is the justice? They deserve the death penalty." But no one could change the verdict. The sentences had been handed down, and the monsters, who had taken Junko's life in the cruelest way possible, would never face the punishment they truly deserved. One by one, the convicted men stood. They exchanged glances, some smirked. Joe Ogura turned to look at Junko's family and smirked, a small gesture but one that sent waves of fury through the room. The four of them were led away, knowing that they would not remain behind bars for long. They had murdered a girl, yet they were not punished as murderers. One day they would walk free, reclaiming the life that Junko had been so brutally robbed of. Behind them, Junko's mother let out a broken sob before collapsing, as if everything inside her had died along with her daughter. Her father remained still, his gaze fixed on the door that had just closed behind the monsters. He said nothing, but his eyes said everything, a silent, crushing despair that no words could ever express. Outside the courthouse, hundreds had gathered waiting for the verdict. When the news broke, an explosion of anger swept through the crowd. Newspapers ran outraged headlines. "Where is the justice? Murderers walk free in just a few years. Junko Furuta suffered in agony, while they get to live on." Flyers calling for legal reform flooded the streets. The public could not accept a justice system that would allow such a heinous crime to go virtually unpunished. But no matter how many protests were held, no matter how many voices cried out, the sentences remained unchanged. The murderers had time. They just had to wait. And as time passed, they would walk out of prison, back into a world that still existed for them, while Junko never got that chance. That day, justice did not stand with Junko Furuta. Her killers may have gone to prison, but they were never truly punished. Those who demanded harsher sentences failed. Those who believed in justice left the courthouse with heavy hearts, and Junko's family, who had waited for a fair verdict, were left with nothing but pain. They had lost their daughter. They had lost everything, and in the end, the only thing left after this trial then was emptiness. Years passed, and the case of Junko Furuta slowly faded into the past, but it never truly disappeared. Those who had once heard her story still carried an unshakable haunting deep within them. The name Junko Furuta was not just a painful memory. It was a grim reminder of what humans were capable of when cruelty knew no limits, when justice failed to arrive in time, when society chose to look away. The house where she had been held captive was torn down, but what happened within its four walls could never be buried. People in the old neighborhood still whispered about it, as if it were a lingering ghost that refused to fade away. A story with no real ending. A pain that could never be soothed. Her parents had waited for justice. They had hoped that one day, those who had committed this unspeakable crime would truly pay for what they had done. But in the end, they realized nothing could ever compensate for what Junko had suffered. When the murderers walked free from prison, Junko's mother knew that she had lost her daughter forever, and with her, she had lost all faith in the fairness of this world. Each passing day, she could do nothing but live in silence, trapped in memories, burdened with questions that would never have answers. Junko's father no longer appeared in public. He did not campaign for changes in the law. He did not demand another trial. He simply lived quietly with his pain, a pain so deep that no court ruling could ever ease it. They did not sue. They did not seek revenge. They did not fight for justice anymore. They simply disappeared into the crowd, carrying a loss too immense for anyone to understand. Those who had committed the crime were never truly free, even after walking out of prison. The law may have spared them, but society did not. Whenever their identities were exposed, public outrage ignited like wildfire. They could live, but the world would never forget who they were. Hiroshi Miyano, the ringleader, thought he could rebuild his life after his release. But in 2013, he was arrested again for assault and fraud. Joe Ogura continued his violent ways after leaving prison, brutally beating his girlfriend nearly to death. He was sentenced to another 7 years in prison. Shinji Minato and Yasushi Watanabe changed their names, hiding in anonymity. But those who remembered the case never stopped watching them. They may have walked out of prison, but they could never escape the eyes of the public. No one forgave them. No one welcomed them back. The case of Junko Furuta forced Japan to confront the flaws in its legal system. After waves of public outrage, the judicial system had no choice but to reform. The lenient sentences given to Junko's killers would never be repeated again. From then on, even minors under 18 could be tried and sentenced as adults if they committed heinous crimes. But no matter how much the law changed, it could never bring Junko back. Justice may have come, but it came too late. It could not ease her family's pain. It could not erase what she had endured for those 44 days. All that remained was a lesson that society had learned at an unbearable cost. The case of Junko Furuta was not just a tragedy. It was a reflection of society's indifference. How many people had heard her cries for help but did nothing? How many people had suspected something was wrong, but chose to stay silent? How many chances were there to save her, but every single one was missed? These questions would never have answers. But one thing was certain: Junko Furuta's story must never be forgotten. It is a reminder that silence can kill. It proves that justice does not always come when it is needed most, that the world does not always work the way we want it to. But more importantly, it warns us that if we continue to turn away from injustice, if we choose to ignore evil, there will be more victims like Junko Furuta. If you want to continue following unsolved cases, chilling mysteries, and haunting tragedies, subscribe to Mysterious Cases on YouTube. Like, share, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Thank you for watching, and remember, every untold story is waiting to be uncovered in the next video.